Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our gardening series with CSU Extension, Planting Container Flowers. Although it's a little bit chilly here in Fort Collins today, there are some sunny summer days right around the corner, and I hope that this webinar provides some gardening inspiration for you. This is our 5th event in the gardening series, with our series concluding on the 27th with pollinators. And we actually have recordings of this entire series available on our YouTube channel. So I highly recommend, if you're looking for additional gardening inspiration, to check out some of those resources. I also want to thank our series sponsor, Fossil Creek Nursery. We'll be including their website in the chat as well. And I want to thank all of you for participating today. Thanks so much to those of you who are already adding to the chat where you're tuning in from and what year you graduated. If you want to go ahead and do that, just click where all panelists and attendees, and then share where you're tuning in from and your grad year if you would like. My colleague is here as well in the chat sharing some awesome information. So that's who's adding different info there. And then if we want to go ahead to the next slide, Carol, I want to give a shout out to our attendees at our CSU Alumni Association members. Thank you so much for your membership. It makes all of our events and different engagement possible. So we'll be including more information in the chat for you as well. As a reminder, this is a webinar. You all know the drill by now, so you are automatically muted with your camera off. So please utilize the Q&A feature and the chat to communicate with us throughout the presentation. We'll have a little bit of time, hopefully, for some questions at the end if Carol doesn't answer those through her presentation. So feel free to pop those in the chat throughout, and I'll be monitoring that too. Excuse me. That's not what you want to have happen during your intro, is get something stuck in your throat, but I will power through. So we also have a lot of virtual events coming up, so we'll be providing that link to our website. One of those events that is so exciting is this Sunday, April 18th, is I Love CSU Day. So that is a really fun celebration at CSU where it's all about just the love of CSU. So we have a trivia night on Sunday night to celebrate. We'll be including that link in the chat. If you'd like to sign up, we'd love to see you there. We'll also send out the recording of this webinar with some additional resources. And then I'll also include a survey link to this to fill out a survey if you want to provide us some feedback for this event and any other topic ideas that you would love to see. So we're going to go ahead and move to the next slide. This is a really fun slide, and Carol is a wonderful resource to talk about this additionally if you have questions. But the CSU Extension's Master Gardener program established Grow and Give in 2020 as a modern victory garden project in response to the heightened levels of food insecurity resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. So now the Grow and Give program continues to address food insecurity in Colorado by connecting backyard and community gardens to food donation sites across the state. So this program provides resources to help you grow and give as part of your harvest, and then share some of your harvest in need. So Carol, our event speaker today, has a great wealth of knowledge on this topic and is really excited about it too. So definitely someone you can reach out to if you have questions. So we'll move to the next slide, because now I get to introduce you to our wonderful event speaker today, Carol. Carol is a CSU Extension Agent in Boulder County, where she works with the Colorado Master Gardener Program. A graduate of CSU with a master's in entomology, Carol has helped backyard gardeners grow success for 22 years. Carol, it is such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Without any further ado, let's jump into our topic of the day. And what better day for us to talk about container gardening when the weather has turned really blustery and we're all stuck inside. I like to talk about spring as it is the honeymoon season for anyone who likes gardening or likes plants, is because we've forgotten about all that, you know, the bugs and the blight and all the drought and the heat and everything that, you know, went on last year. And we're in love with our gardens again this year. Container gardening is something that isn't something that everybody considers, but I always wonder why, when it can really add a lot of elements to your landscape, whether or not you already have a yard with landscape or not. Gardening in containers can really add a lot of spice and interest to your yards. I mean, some of the reasons that people have given us for gardening in containers is that they have limited time. And they still want a lot of beauty, but they don't want to have to take a lot of effort and a lot of time to go out and plow up the yard in order to re-landscape every year. Container gardens are portable to an extent. Some of the bigger ones, you really don't want to move around a lot, but little ones, you can move. You can practice. Maybe you're trying some plants and, if they look good in this area, maybe they don't work well. It's great as a gardener like myself. I'm getting a little bit older now, and maybe I don't want to have to crouch down in order to, access the flowers or anything. So it's great for people that have health issues or a little bit limited mobility. Kids love it. It's right at a child's height, so they love having a pot by themselves. You might not have a lot of space. Maybe you don't have a yard. Maybe you have just a patio. Maybe you have a balcony, but definitely you could have some great containers in that. And then some people really struggle with poor soil, bad exposure. Maybe the exposure on the green and growing areas in your yard are not conducive for a lot of plants. It could be that they're heavily shaded if you're living in an older section of town. And you can put containers in areas that are sunny. Maybe it's too sunny. Maybe you have an altered ecosystem. Maybe you have a lot of reflected heat that makes difficult, growing conditions in certain areas. But whatever it is, I think most people enjoy the change that containers can really bring to your garden. So first things first, before we get into just going out to the store because all the sales are happening, and I know you want to do this, but I'm asking you to just be patient. Do a little site evaluation. Take a look at what you want those containers to do. Do you want to enhance the view or do you want to block it? I mean, if you really don't want to look at your neighbor's Winnebago, but you don't have, 15 years to wait until trees grow up to block it, containers can be installed in those areas with trellises on them, and you can grow a annual vine on it, like the black-eyed Susan vine, or you could grow, something a little more robust like clematis, which is a perennial. But the vines can come out of these containers and they can grow up these trellises, so you don't have to stare at the neighbor's Winnebago. You can block that altogether, and it'll be something that can change every year until those trees that you have planted there maybe get a little more height to them. So if you need an immediate solution to a problem like that, a containerized planting can really help. I mentioned before, you have to take a look at the available light. If you want to grab these containers that are on sale right now, I saw an ad that was advertising cool season, they're pansies in containers, and 2 for $12 or something, and they're exciting, and you bring them home, but the only place that you have to put them is to hang them up in full south-facing sun. That might not be the best plan for those particular plants. You have to consider the light that you have, the light that will happen in summer, and the light that the plant needs. So that's all about exposure. But exposure also takes into consideration some wind. And wind in Colorado can be really, really problematic to plants. I'm going to go back one here. Let's see here. This container, I love the colocasia, the elephant ears that are in here. And I myself have tried to use some dwarf bananas, which have really big leaves too. My problem is I have, the only area I can put them in is a wind tunnel, and it really tatters their leaves. So exposure is a huge thing to consider. And then also the microclimate. As I mentioned before, you can have an area that is south facing and it's a wall. The reflected heat in the middle of summer is going to be really brutal in that area. Can the plants take that kind of heat? So these are all those considerations that you should be dreaming about right now as we get this blustery weather going through. Consider existing structures and already existing vegetation. Right now, when you look outside and say, okay, I have a patio, I want to put some great planters out there, I want it to look like something out of a catalog, and it's really easy to be dreaming that way. It's like, look at this, this is perfect. But if you have a deciduous tree that hasn't leafed out yet, did you remember that that is going to be in the shade? So, existing vegetation already there can either help or hinder a planting. If you have a tree that's located nearby and it leaves out, and so you get beautiful morning sun, but then the afternoon, the broiling heat is shaded because the shadow of the tree falls over it. That's perfect. That's what we're looking for. Try to buffer some of that intense sunlight and heat. You can also see if you have a structure like here with that really slanted fence, and then you have a bench, plants can really soften that sort of thing. So that's a different consideration. It's not whether you should put the plants there. Rather, what I want you to consider is, why aren't you putting plants there? Because plants can really soften. They can bring out a lot of accents that you may not think about. So really, give some thought from a mind's eye for design to where you can put these containers. And I need you to consider how that space is used. And this is one of those, basically, this is a gut check. Is this a good spot for containers? Just because the area doesn't have anything in it and it needs something, it's crying out for meaning, doesn't mean that's ideal. You have kids or pets that use that area regularly. Do you like to entertain in that spot? Is it, used for storage? What are the traffic patterns coming through there? Do you have to move your big trash cans through there a lot? Do you have spigots nearby so it's easy to water? And, this is stuff that we have to really take into consideration, because if you're planting an annual plant like this relative of a tomato plant, and it's an area where you get a lot of traffic running through there, that can be a really unpleasant surprise for anybody brushing past this. And if you're not taking into consideration, some of the smaller residents of your area, like kids or pets, then you could end up having something like this. Bella didn't mean any harm, but she's curious, she's a puppy, and she got into a little bit of mischief. So after you've taken a look at your location that you want to, kind of spice up a little bit, choosing a container is easy, but there are a few things to avoid. You want to make sure that all of your containers have drainage. It needs a drain hole, or you go with pot in pot. In other words, if you have a beautiful container, but it doesn't have a drain hole in it, then you could put some rocks down at the bottom of that and put a potted plant inside of it. So the plastic pot slides in like a sleeve, and then you have drainage out into the rocks below, and you could use pot and pot. But what is ideal is to have a drainage hole so you never get a bathtub effect where you're watering through and then the water kind of ponds back up against the planting itself. I think it stands to reason that we don't want to use containers that used to have toxic substances. But there are some antique tins that we kind of like and we want to make use of it, but it might not be something that is a good idea for us to plant into, especially if you're going to grow edibles in these containers. We talk about some containers you can use, but with a little bit of caution, and the moss baskets are one of them. They're fantastic and I love them, don't get me wrong, but they dry out too rapidly here in Colorado because we're at somewhat arid location. If you really want to use those moss baskets, then go ahead, by all means, put the moss liner in. So from the outside, you're seeing the moss, but then you have to line it with a little bit of plastic before you put the soil in. Make sure you poked holes in the plastic so it runs through, and then you could put your soil in there and plant. So visually you're seeing the moss, but it's not drying out like typical here. And then those topsy-turvy planters, the upside down planters that people, it was a fad a few years ago. They have problems. Hopefully we'll get to the last slide where I can go on my rant about those, but there's a lot of cautions to trying to plant a plant upside down. So when you're choosing a container, beyond those considerations, anything will do. You can go in a wheelbarrow, you can go with hanging baskets, whiskey barrels. You can take an old stump and route out the center of it and, use it as a container. Come in from the side to install some drain holes, and usually people will kind of tap in a pipe of some type in there to channel it out. Old window boxes, just about anything, boots, you can use clogs, you can use old Crocs. You can plant into a wide variety of things as long as you have drainage and there was no toxic substance. Then, depending on what you decide to plant into your containers, some of them may need trellising. I talked about using the black-eyed Susan vine or something else like that in order to block a view. If you're growing other edibles that are like cucumbers or that sort of thing, some need trellising, and you have to consider what your plant's needs are. In some cases, can they tumble a little bit? Sure they can. But if you're in a confined space or a smaller space, you want to take them up a trellis, and that will give some visual interest also. If you have a wall that you want to have, climbing plants on, and you can do this with a container, you can install it, and then you can put the trellis up near the wall or even anchor it to it and have the plant use the trellis to climb up rather than the wall itself. In this way, you can have annuals that change out, or you can avoid having problems with plants sinking anchoring roots into brick sides or siding and causing a problem for that structure. Keep in mind that once you make a commitment to having a container plant, what you're putting in becomes entirely dependent upon you, the human that put it in that situation. So these plants will have a restricted root system. All of the water, all of the fertilizer, everything they need now is up to you. And I am trying to make you realize that the pressure is on you so you can be a good plant parent. If the soil becomes too dry, then there are fine root hairs that are going to be compromised, and the plant is going to be struggling to survive. And if you're using a mixture that doesn't have any soil in it, so the planting media is soilless, then they could have a lot lower nutrient levels and than planting in the ground, and that's most of our potting soils. You're going to have to pay attention to the fertilizer needs of that plant because it's not getting it from any other location. So when we're considering watering our plants, this is something that we pay attention to. Some containers, the plastic ones, will hold water better in the soil than those that are porous, like the terracotta or the clay pots. Terracotta or clay pots will wick water away from that soil until it becomes, nice and moist, and then breezes blowing across it will wick that water away also. So they can dry out a little bit faster. Now, if they're glazed on the outside, that doesn't happen as much. You get a little bit of soil wicking or moisture wicking, but the wind doesn't pull it off. Regardless, we still have to pay attention to what the plant needs. So as I mentioned, plants that are containerized are going to need water a little more often. When you water, make sure the water runs out of the drain hole, and we don't want to have it on a coaster or plate or anything that allows it to puddle up and then be taken back up into the planter itself. This is because we want the any salts that build up, especially from fertilizers, to flush through and drain off. So you want that water to drain out. You will have watered the soil adequately if you water it until you can see it coming out the bottom and allow it to run away. One of the things to consider is how frequently you need to water the containers. If they are in an exposed area, say you have them on a patio or a deck or someplace in full sun in summer in Colorado, the size of the plant and the time of the year it is means you may end up having to water it more than once a day. You may have to water it twice a day. So if you can, and if you're in the workforce, what you need to do as you start putting these containers out is to go back, talk to your supervisor, talk to your boss, make sure they understand that you are now a plant parent and that you're going to need a little bit more flexibility in your scheduling time so that you can go home and make sure your plants are watered. Well, my boss doesn't buy that, but maybe your boss will, I don't know. Some people use the soil holding polymers or the water holding polymers, pardon me. And these are starch based gels, and they will take in a lot of water, they will swell up, and then they will release it back to the roots of the plant, or just it leaches out a little bit into the potting soil, and it can really help extend the length of time between waterings. So you may not have to become this, kind of a slave to making sure the plant is watered several times a day. One caution about using these crystals is a little bit goes a long way. When you get the package, they'll tell you it's only a tablespoon of these crystals that you sprinkle into the potting soil, and then you want to moisten it so that they take up water before you're planting. If you mix them in and then you plant and then you water everything, the level in the pot that you would have put in there will actually be pushed out because these polymers, they swell and they'll take in as much water as you can give them. And eventually they can push the plants right out of the top of your container. So you want to water them, you want to moisten them before you use them for planting, and then be careful how much you put into the soil that you're mixing so that you're not getting an imbalance. When we have torrential rainstorms, some of these polymers can really kind of get too moistened in the containers, and you'll see a little bit of this kind of push out from the polymers, moving the soil and the plants out of the containers. So as I mentioned before, you want to water by need, not on a schedule. Mid-season takes a couple of times a day, perhaps. And it's then, sorry, I'll get my train of thought back on track here. Early in the season, when the plants are little and the weather is a little bit cooler, you may not have to water these containers every day even. You check them, and you do that with just a finger, put it into the soil up to the first knuckle, and that's what you're looking for to check the water. Later in the summer, even, though the plants are large and might be shading the pot itself, because they're large, they're using a lot more of the available water in that pot. So you need to pay attention to a couple of times a day checking them. If it's windy, then that will wick moisture out also. If we're going through the monsoon season and it becomes that we're getting rainstorms every afternoon, you probably don't need to water as much, especially if the containers are in an area where they're exposed so that they get rainfall on them. So just as a wrap up, the watering depends on the size of the plant and the amount of soil that's in there. Characteristics of the soil, does it have those polymers in it? Will it hold it? Is it a type of soil that is, a heavy one that holds a lot of water, or is it soilless and it really doesn't hold water as well? The container we talked about, whether it's got the glazed sides or if it's plastic or if it is porous like terracotta. There are drip irrigation systems that I do recommend. If you're putting in a lot of pots, like that one photo we saw at the beginning, if you're putting in a lot of pots, then drip irrigation system is really nice, especially if you can put it on some kind of a timer to water your plants, because they're just spaghetti lines that go right into each pot. So they're a little bit unobtrusive, and it allows for watering of the pots, especially those that might be in full sun versus the ones that are a little bit more buffered with shade, and they don't need irrigation quite as much. So fertilizers, we do need to fertilize plants in containers. An easy way to do it is if it's water soluble, these that you take a tablespoon of it, and they're usually blue, and you mix it in with water and you follow the package rates. The rates on the package for the fertilizer will tell you what it should be for any containerized plant. And you mix it in with the water and you use it. It's easy to apply. Other people prefer to have a timed release fertilizer in the soil itself, products like Osmocote or something that are coated, and then it releases over time. And this is great. These are a really steady feed for a containerized plant. And I do like them because it takes a lot of guesswork out right up until mid-July to the end of July. And I say that because the release rates of that particular type of fertilizer are based on a couple of things. One is the temperature of the soil and how much moisture is kept in the soil. Under spring conditions, it's not a problem and it is a slow release. But once the soil temperatures rise above 72 degrees, about that, the release rates are faster. So that might not be a 3-month feed from that timed release fertilizer. It might be a little bit shortened. At that point, I'm asking you to take a look at your plants to see if their growth rate is a little bit slowed, but also if they're starting to yellow and maybe not look quite as green as they used to be. At that point, it's not a problem. What you do is get some of the liquid fertilizers. You can get something that's organic. You could get something that is, synthetically created. Mix it up and pour it in to give a boost to your plants really towards the end of the summer season. Basically, you want to watch really closely through August and into September for this. The fertilizers that we recommend, you need a balanced fertilizer. Because they're not growing in our soil, and our native soils are naturally high already in phosphorus and potassium, a containerized mix is not. So you need a balanced fertilizer, one that has all the macronutrients, the nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and all the micronutrients, because that plant is entirely dependent upon the fertilizer that we're going to be applying to it as its parent. So, the last 2 points on this slide, if it's water soluble, use it every 2 to 3 weeks and supplement those timed release fertilizers later in the season. So beyond that kind of maintenance, planning your containers for what you're going to be putting into them so that you have that, visual appeal and success. It's hugely important to take a look at the kind of growth rate these plants would have. You want to put those with similar growth rates together. And you can see that on the plant tag, and it will talk about whether it is a vigorous grower or not. And if they're using words like vigorous, then you know that this is going to fill that container spot pretty quickly. And you want to put those together. Pardon me. So when you're planting your containers, when you're planting them, take your smaller transplants and put them together. And we're kind of pushing in a few closer together than what you normally would in, say, a annual bed or an area border or something in your landscape. We're going to be spacing them a little bit tighter in your container because they're going to grow up and you want it to really fill out, but also because you're giving them all the resources they need and they're not in competition with one another in, say, a bed or a border, but you're fertilizing them and you're watering them to make sure they have what they need. We can kind of crowd these plants a little bit. If you want to use the hydrogels, that's up to you. And I've already talked about the slow release fertilizer. Besides growth rate, match your plants with similar needs in light, in water, in how much fertilizer they take, the kind of temperatures they like to grow in, and heat tolerant. So we're putting together sun-loving plants or plants for shade. We're putting these together so that you're not left with sun-loving plants that are going great guns, and then you've got a plant like a Lobelia that can't take our intense sunlight, and it burns out and it leaves that kind of an empty space in your container. You really want to pay attention to the kind of sunlight and exposure and all these other things as you're making your combinations. And then how do you design for visual appeal? And this is something for Rachel, is we put 3 types of plants together to get that real pop-in container type result. And they are considered thriller, filler, and spillers. That's the way we go at it. Thrillers are the ones that add a little bit of surprise or shock value and interest in height to the container itself. They're the ones that really make that kind of a bold statement. It means you don't have a flat top on a container. These are not typically used in the globe containers. Those are the ones that we want them to grow as a ball. These are the ones that are typically down low, sitting on the patio or the deck, and it has a little bit of height to it. It can have, flowers, it can have leaf color, it can have different textures, this sort of thing. And here are a couple of examples for you. The plants, the container that is on the right-hand side here has that thriller. It's a canna, and so it's got those really nice kind of tropical looking leaves to it that have several colors in them. And then it's got these bloom spikes coming up with these flowers that are just punctuating. And it is a really, really striking plant to have in a container. I love having cannas in there. Some that you can consider would be one of the newer ones, Aromato Basil, and that's shown on the left here. And that's got a beautiful two-tone purple and kind of a chartreuse look to it. So it's very interesting. Some of the thriller plants that are pretty popular are begonias. Lantana can be really interesting. Impatiens. Some of the spikes, the kind of dracaenas, they look like grasses or grasses themselves. All of these can be really nice thriller plants. And this is, some of the thriller plants like the elephant ears or the caladiums, they're the ones that add that big dramatic interest to the plant itself. Then we have the midsection of the container, the fillers themselves. The fillers add some density to the center of the container, so you don't have something growing up here and then there's nothing until you get into the spillers, those that are tumbling over the sides of the plant. So they add a little bit of bulk in the center of it. You can see here in this example, so the thriller is going to be that Japanese bloodgrass, that grass that's standing up, which has that two-tone green and red to it. But the filler is going to be these plants that are in between there. We have a little bit of, went forward too fast. We have, heucheras in there. We have some coleus in there. They're beautiful textures and colors, and it really adds that density to it. Some filler plants that are really popular are some agastaches, which are another name for hyssop, basils, Celosias, Euphorbia. The Euphorbia, I can't sing enough praises about. If you look at this image of the hanging basket here, the Euphorbia are the small white flowers that you see spangling through that whole planting. It's a really understated plant, but when you put it together with something like your petunias here, it absolutely makes that container sparkle. It just is a great filler. Some of the plants that we can use to thrill us also make great fillers. And so that's where Lantana comes back in, or some of our fuchsias, or maybe even ornamental cabbages and kale. And then in the design, the third part would be the spiller. So the spillers are those that are going to soften the edge of the container itself. They're going to tumble over the sides, maybe tumble down onto whatever they're sitting on, perhaps. These are the ones that really bridge the ground to the top of the container itself. And spillers are hugely important in the design themselves. You can see here we have the sweet potato vine on the left here. And it is one that the breeders have been really going to town with. You can find them in a variety of colors. You can see here we have the chartreuse one. There is one that is so dark it's almost black. There's one that's kind of an amber color, sort of a bronze look to it. Really nice. Or we could go with spillers like the fuchsia that is shown on the right. I am going to be honest, this is probably the one plant that refuses to grow for me. Looks fantastic in the garden center. I purchase it, I get it into my car, and by the time I get it home, it has already given up the ghost. But if you're successful, if you have the right location, one that is, you know, somewhat buffered from a lot of heat, it's got great humidity in it because that plant likes humidity, you might be more successful than I am at it. Some of the spillers that are really popular can be alyssum, it can be verbenas, some of the Bidens, calibrachoas. These are the ones that look like small petunias. We also know them as million bells, creeping zinnias, pansies themselves. There's a number of spillers out there that do extremely well. And don't underestimate the power of having just one plant in a container. If you do that, but have multiple containers and they all have these plants that look fantastic with one another, there's nothing wrong with putting just one plant into that container itself. Just remember to try to crowd them in a little bit. You want to put, 5 or 6 plants into a container so that there's a lot of plant material when they start sizing up. And then just place them close together so that they're accenting one another and really coming on as one entirely well-woven whole. If you're wondering about how you would combine colors, you could go with contrasting colors, and that adds a lot of drama. But you could go with pale colors in different shades, just, light whites with lavenders and, some of the paler blues and pinks. That's going to be up to you. Some people have a natural eye for design. I like to use the color wheel like you see here and go with a couple rules of the way the human eye sees color and the effect it has on the space where it's sitting. If you have a large space and you want to try to bring it in a little closer visually so that you're feeling a little cozier, warm colors fill spaces and it makes them feel a little bit smaller. Whereas cool tones recede a little bit, and it can make a smaller space feel a little bit larger. You don't feel crowded visually with cooler tones in a small area like a balcony. But there is no getting away from the fact that a lot of human emotion is lifted by a lot of bright, warm colors. We just love to see it. And, by all means, work with whatever palette of color you'd like to have this year. A lot of the plants are annual, so you know what, if it isn't working out, next year you can try a completely different palette of colors. Different textures add a lot of drama to a container, and by texture we're talking about what is the leaf shape, what is the leaf size, are the flowers in spikes, are the flowers in bells, are they trumpet shaped? A lot of different textures mixing together means that the eye roves over that particular container and its beauty more than just one skim and you're done. So you can look at it like you would this container and kind of get lost in traveling around to see all the bits and pieces of it. So you can see here we have a coleus in the center, and you've got the calibrachoa, the smaller pansy looking or petunia looking plant. And then there's a little bit of creeping jenny. This is a great combination. And you can be a friend to pollinators too. I know that you're going to have a talk like that you can tune into in a couple of weeks, but the combinations that you make in your containers will be a source of happiness for these pollinators also. So consider planting for our bees and butterflies. You can see I love Lantana because I keep talking about it, but it is one of those plants that when it's in bloom, you know, that they're nectar rich, and so our pollinators really love it. Other attractants could be zinnias, salvias, pentas, dianthus. Now, if you're going with zinnias, I do want to say that the zinnias that are really popular with the pollinators are not the ones that are doubled or triple blooming. These are the, you know, basic, you know, the single petaled zinnias. Those are the ones that they like. Ones where they can really get at the nectaries themselves. So there's a number of plants that will work well for pollinators. And again, on the plant tag, it's going to tell you that, you know, it could be pollinator friendly. Some popular flowers for baskets, begonias, black-eyed Susans, fuchsia, lantana, lobelia. I encourage you to go back on the YouTube and look at this if you're looking for this list so that you can have it and write it down today. We don't have a lot of time for that. And then I want to finish out the talk by giving a couple of mentions on edibles in containers. There's no reason why you can't use a container to grow an awful lot of different types of vegetables. Certainly we do. Enjoy having some of the vegetables growing in containers because they can be really, really ornamental. The eggplant, for example, is a fuzzy-leafed plant that has gloriously lavender flowers. It's a beautiful plant that makes a great decorative plant as well. But as you can see here on these three images, you can go as simple as just having strawberries tumbling over a basket. You could have lettuces and other little spring greens growing in, or you could have, like the container on the left, a whole series of herbs in pots sitting around your patio. And the herbs can be really, really aromatic. And so it's a nice, you know, second sense beyond just visually that you can take pleasure out of. The things to keep in mind when you're going with vegetables or fruits in a container is size does matter. You don't want to go with some of the big, bold heirlooms because heirlooms are not known to be self-contained. Most of the time, the heirlooms that we have, especially I'm talking about squashes or I'm talking about pumpkins or tomatoes, this type of thing, they are really enthusiastic in growing, and a container may not be a good choice. What I'm asking you to choose is something that is dwarf, patio, pixie, these things in the name of whatever plant you're putting in. It means it's going to stay somewhat small, and that's ideal for growing in a container. The popular ones to grow in containers are tomatoes. And so I am going to give you some advice on growing these two things, cherries and full-size tomatoes, in a container. If you're going with a cherry tomato, again, go with the cherry tomatoes that are for patio pots. Cherry tomatoes, otherwise they have, you know, manifest destiny on their mind, and they're going to take over and be, you know, 8-foot vines and a little bit out of control. But if you go with the ones that are really designed for containers, and I've listed some here, like Tiny Tim or Pixie, Tumblin' Tom, all these will do extremely well. And you can get away with putting these plants in a 1-gallon pot. in full sun. So they're going to need, at least 12 hours of sun, 8 to 12 hours of sun. And some of them might need a little bit of a trellis, but the really little ones like Tumblin' Tom or Lozano, which is pictured here, they don't need to be trellised. And that's a bonus also. If you choose to go for some of the larger tomatoes, then again, stay with the dwarf plants. And there is an entire line designed for containers. And when you're looking online to see which ones you want to grow, search for the Container Tomato Project. And that should help you locate, some names of tomatoes that'll do extremely well in containers. But plan on a big enough pot for these. And that is a 5-gallon pot. So that's a big container for that tomato. It doesn't matter what size planter they're selling them in at the store. Usually you're going to get them in a 1-gallon pot. You need to plant them in a pot bigger than that. A 5-gallon container for a standard size tomato is the recommendation. Superbush is great. Demodoff, any of the tomatoes in the Husky family would do well. Amelia would do extremely well. I do recommend that one for containerized tomatoes. And we do have a couple of minutes, so I am going to go on my rant and talk about this upside down planter. The advertisings for this, and this was really popular a few years ago, the advertising showed people picking these gigantic beefsteak tomatoes off of their tomato plants that grew. But here's a couple of noteworthy things to remember about these containers is plants naturally follow the sun. The geotrophism of a plant means that it will grow towards sunlight. So yeah, it'll grow down, but then it's going to try to grow up. And the thing about tomatoes is the vines aren't necessarily strong enough to do to grow up and support the weight of the fruit. So there's a lot of tearing on it. You could use other plants like flowering plants in these upside down containers, no problem at all, because they can grow up and they don't have this, fruit that's basically a giant sack of water hanging off of the vine. If you decide to use these, for everything that you hold dear, don't use a China cup hook to hang them from. These are heavy containers because there is soil in that bag. And you want a hook that is going to be robust enough, but also have one of those little clips to close the hole, the opening of the hook, so that when it gets windy, these are not rocking and then being, taken off the hook and flying into the head of someone you love. So I'd recommend that you use a hook that's strong enough. Try to put them in an area that doesn't have a lot of wind and see if you can't get a hook with a closure. If you need any more references on growing in containers, please check out these websites. CSU Extension has a lot of fact sheets on containers and also other types of gardening. Grow and Give, a modern victory garden project. You heard the plug for that at the beginning. We have all kinds of information on small, little narrated PowerPoints, fact sheets, webinars on growing all kinds of different food crops. And then if you're going to be Googling something, make sure to get research-based information by adding site.edu or site:/edu at the end of your search term, and then that way it calls up university research-based resources. Great, thank you very much. And we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carol. That was really fun. And I loved my little shout out about, planning those thrillers, fillers, and spillers. So I will definitely be sending you some photos this summer when I plant. So one of our first questions is, what potting soil do you recommend for pots?
Well, I can't give you a brand name per se because we're unbiased, but some of the things to look for is a nice blend of peat, either perlite or vermiculite in there, And, you know, it might have some time-release fertilizer in it. The soil-based mixes can be a lot heavier, but most of your potting soils are going to be soilless. I'd be careful using some of the less expensive products because you do get what you pay for. And sometimes you open up these less expensive potting mixes and it's a lot of undecomposed forest products. So they've ground up, you know, pallets and that sort of thing. So peat moss, some compost, I missed mentioning that, perlite or vermiculite, and then some time-release fertilizers.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol. Someone is curious, will cucumbers or squash be too heavy to grow on a trellis or cage?
That's a great question. And in the classic extension answer, I'm going to say it depends. Normally, okay, so I'm going to geek out for a minute, right? You have some cucumbers that you want to harvest when they're smaller, and they would not be too heavy for the vine on the trellis. What you don't want is for them to get oversized, because then they will pull the vine and do some tearing because cucumbers don't naturally slip. In other words, they don't release themselves from the vine itself. Some growers, in the case of cucumbers, and then also with the squashes or the melons, what they do is they sling the fruit. So they will take, well, some take pantyhose and they tie one end to the trellis, sling it under the plant, and tie it to the other side of the trellis so that the fruit is sitting in a hammock, and that's how they grow them. And this is great, especially if you're like on a balcony or something where you really need to grow up and make use of that space. I've seen some extremely good slings made out of, you know, you get the mesh bags that the onions come in, or say the potatoes, and they slit those around the seam. So it's, you know, a big kind of a flat fabric. And then they use, you know, just some hooks, like just any kind of a stout hook that's not going to pull open through that webbing. And then they just kind of use it with a bungee to hang it up. The big thing to consider, and the last thing I'll talk about with the slinging of the fruit, is you want to make sure that whatever hammock you're creating is going to be able to support the entire fruit, whether it's a cucumber, whether it's a squash, whether it's a melon, as it gets up to size. Because if you put a tiny little hammock underneath a watermelon, by the time the watermelon sizes up, it's like looking at a bikini on a hippo, and it's not going to do the job. So you want to put a hammock under it that's going to be large enough to support that fruit.
Awesome. That's fun. I like all those creative solutions for those. That's really fun to think about. So we have someone asking, are polymer crystals safe to use in pots for edibles?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I would have to look that up. So you can see my email is here. If you don't mind shooting me an email, I'm happy to look that up for you and give you that answer.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol. So we have Brad from Craig, Colorado. He said hummingbirds are coming soon and would like to help them. Do local extension offices offer any assistance in this area?
Not sure what you mean by assistance in that area. We have a lot of information. You have to give me a little more information, Brad.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, definitely reach out to Carol and also check out the extension website. You can search, it's really user-friendly. I've used it a lot for specific questions like that too. We have someone curious, is there a way to keep squirrels out of just seeded pots? And then they have a question about red pepper with watet, which I'm not really sure entirely what that means.
Okay, so the squirrel, yeah, those are my nemesis. I'm just going to be, you know, completely transparent and say I battle the squirrels all the time. fencing, caging, putting a little cap above the newly seeded container, and then some chicken wire is honestly the only way to keep them out. You could try, okay, there is some repellents, and you can't use them around anything edible. And you really don't want them around an area where you're going to be sitting and relaxing, because they're based in peppers. They're based in black peppers and hot peppers, and you can smell it when you use it. And it does works fantastic in beds to keep them out of bulbs and that sort of thing. But with containers, it's a little more challenging. And so the only thing that I can say is you got to fence them off of it. And then could you spell the name of the pepper thing that you're talking about?
It says, what about red pepper with W-A-T-E-T? Watet?
I'm sorry, I don't know what that is.
All right, Wilma, please email Carol, and
Yeah.
she will, hopefully maybe it was a typo, or maybe there's a specific thing you're wondering, and we'd love to help you. I'm glad I'm not the only one who wasn't quite sure what that was. All right, so next one, someone says, thank you so much, Carol. This is a wonderful overview. I like to use large pots, but I don't want to fill the entire pot with planting soil. What do you recommend as a filler item from the bottom of large pots so that the pots don't become overly heavy and we don't use more soil than needed for planting?
I love this question. It's a great question because I have some huge pots too, and I don't fill them all either. Some of what I do is I'll take pantyhose basically, and I'll fill it with the packing peanuts, not the ones that are the biodegradable ones. I don't want them to break down. And then I'll just kind of coil those in the base, and then use overturned planter, the black plastic pots in the base as well. And that takes up a lot of volume underneath. Some people will just use these overturned containers, a couple of them, to take up the space below as well. So those are a couple of ideas for you.
Fabulous. Great tip. All right, Stephanie has a question. What is the best one plant that you suggest for a container in minimal sun and then also for full sun? And she's also curious what you think about snapdragons as well.
I'm a big fan of the snapdragon. Yeah, I'm a little geek for Halloween, and I love how when the flower fades on a snapdragon, the seed pod looks like a skull. So you really can't, sing the praises of a snapdragon too much because they're glorious plants. One plant for not a lot of sun. I love Lobelia. It's a plant that I covet because I don't have a lot of areas in shade, but there is a line of begonias that I recommend you check out, and it is from Iconia. So I''Conia is the company, and they are a double blooming begonia that, you can't beat it. It is just absolutely breathtaking to look at.
Those are awesome suggestions. I will be Googling that as well. Thank you so much. Wilma came back with, that was supposed to be water. So it was a tip on red peppers, like how to water those.
Oh, okay. So with peppers and eggplants, that type of thing, you don't want to overwater them. Peppers are so wonderful in a container. Honestly, if you're going to grow any one of the, the vegetables in a container, the peppers are ideal. Any of the peppers that you want to grow in a container is absolutely awesome. And, just making sure you check it once a day is fantastic. They're not something like a cucumber that if it gets water stressed, the cucumber is going to be bitter, the fruit that's forming at that time, but that's not the case with the pepper. However, if a pepper is water stressed and it is one of the ones that is a hot pepper, that has capsaicin, the stress of not having enough water will make that pepper hotter. So the development of the capsaicin, the heat in any of our peppers, is a result of stress. So if you overwater it, if you underwater it, either way, you're going to have peppers that are hotter. But if these are bell peppers, just checking it once a day is great. However, bell peppers, any of them, not just bells, but any of the peppers, they're really susceptible to sun scald. So I would give them some buffering with shade in the later afternoons and try to make it so that sunlight doesn't fall on the pepper itself.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carol. We are at 1 p.m. So I know there were a couple more questions in the chat. Carol is such a fantastic resource for you. So she does have her email up here if you were wanting to reach out to her directly, or if you have questions about who your local extension office is. If you're in Colorado, I'm happy to help you with that as well. Carol, did you have any final words for us today?
Just go forth and garden.
Wow, I couldn't have said it better myself, Carol. Well, thank you so, so much for your time and your expertise today. This was a fabulous presentation. Thank you to our series sponsor, Fossil Creek Nursery. And please let us know, like I said, if you have any questions, we'll be sending these this awesome recording out to you all for resources as well. Go forth and garden, like Carol said. Go Rams. Take care, everybody.